welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hi, this is Jessica with Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast, and we have a health reference episode today. And once again, we have Dr. Shuttle Shah, who is one of our residents.
Yes, I'm Dr. Shuttle Shah. I'm a pediatrician and neonatologist at Westchester Medical Center, and I'm currently serving as the president of the Long Island chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics.
Okay, and with us today, you have brought...
My name is Mary Cataletto. I'm a pediatric pulmonologist at NYU Langone in the Long Island campus, and I am chair of the American College of Chest Physicians Pediatric Network.
And
I'm Rachel Boykin. I am a pediatric hospitalist at Stony Brook Children's Hospital in Stony Brook, Long Island, and I'm also a member of the executive committee of the section on tobacco control of the American Academy of Pediatrics.
Welcome. Thank you very much for coming. So our topic today is vaping and electronic cigarettes. How long, this is just a quick question. How long has the technology been, I make it sound like a computer, but how long has this been around? Because I feel like it just kind of popped up out of nowhere and they've been around for a while.
So electronic cigarettes actually are attributed to a Chinese inventor around 2007, although I think they were prototypes. Tobacco companies were doing this in the 60s, but it never took off. They've really become popular, and as of 2014, they've been the most popular tobacco product in the States.
It's actually been very interesting because right now, Juul has more than 50% of the market share. So
wow.
It's one of the most common e-cigarette formats that you can find, or devices, and very popular among the adolescents.
So for parents who aren't familiar in general, what are e-cigarettes? How do they differ from a traditional cigarette? And also, what about these newer products like Juul, like you just mentioned, and is it Fix with a PH? What about them?
Well, e-cigarettes differ from traditional cigarettes in a number of ways. The e-cigarettes, also known for vaping or Juuls, are electronic devices that heat a solution that contains usually nicotine and some solvents and some flavorings into a vapor, basically. But the truth is that a vapor is a gas, and so this is not quite exactly a vapor, but rather an aerosol, because it's got some moisture in it, and it also can have other particulate matter that can be damaging to the lungs.
And, we are now, we're talking a lot about Juul, which is considered a fourth generation. So the first generations were what we might have called cigalikes. They were imitating cigarettes. And then the second and third generations evolved. And some of the features that I think are important to consider in all of these are that they are potentially modifiable, so that they can be personalized, including the fourth generations like Juul, and that they use an e-liquid. Mary mentioned like the solvents, and so there are other components in addition to the nicotine which are potentially concerning, and those things, including flavorings, which have their toxicities. Those things are quite customizable. There are over 15,000 flavors that are available. So it's a market that looks very different in many ways from the tobacco market.
Sure. I mean, I remember menthol was, I think, the only other flavor but tobacco flavor when I was a teenager.
So actually, tobacco flavors.
Not that sounds tasty, but you know.
Well, tobacco flavors were banned in 2009 under the Tobacco Control Act, and except for menthol, because there was a big fight. And now, and I think that was one of the things when you ask adolescents. What gets them to use these products, what entices them, it's the flavorings, among other things. But flavorings are a very, very big reason. And so one of the big differences is that, yes, there's only one flavor of cigarette, and there's thousands of flavors of e-cigarettes, and the flavors are often what attracts kids to them.
So over the past 50 years, we've seen a substantial progress in reducing tobacco use, particularly in children. Some of us still remember when you can smoke on airplanes and restaurants and parks. I always kind of describe my childhood like restaurant experience, like everything was kind of dingy. Like even if you were not in the smoking area, you could smell it. Everything was kind of covered in ash. So I remember that smoking used to be more pervasive. You know, you'd even see it in child-oriented movies and TV shows. How has the introduction of electronic cigarettes and vaping impacted the reductions that we've heard in reducing childhood nicotine exposure?
The use of electronic cigarettes has been increased primarily because it's so attractive, because it doesn't have the social stigma that traditional tobacco had, because it smells nice. It's not something that's offensive, and it's socially acceptable. The tobacco companies have used the same marketing strategies they did for cigarettes, you know, in terms of sporting events and scholarships and fun things, you know, with having actors who look younger, having a wonderful life, and having their opportunity to mix their flavors and make their life more pleasant. But it's still, nicotine is an addictive substance.
And I would add, just for people who may not be aware, all of those things that Mary mentioned that, you know, that the tobacco companies do are basically banned now. And, you know, from starting in the 70s, when you no longer could have ads on TV, for example, we can see ads on TV for e-cigarettes. That's not banned. To the Master Settlement Agreement in 98, and then the Tobacco Control Act, which really chipped away. So now you can't smoke on a plane. You can't have advertising in magazines that appeals to children. You can't sponsor sporting events, et cetera. And all of these things are completely unregulated right now, for the most part, with electronic cigarettes. So it is kind of, you could look and say, this looks like we looked 40 years ago with tobacco, with what the tobacco companies are doing. And it's really scary.
I also think it's important for people to realize that, you know, we're talking a lot about the targeting and the marketing and the use in some cases, preteens and teens. But a lot of the kids understand, and they've gotten the health message that, quote unquote, cigarettes are bad. But they haven't made the connection to that e-cigarettes contain nicotine, and nicotine is addictive. So they don't understand that they're using an addictive product. And I think that's one of the major knowledge gaps that a lot of these children have. And there are even parents who don't really understand and think that they're as safe or safer, who think they're safer actually than traditional cigarettes.
I know that for a fact, because I have friends who are parents, and they, you know, they'll be like, I guess it could be, you know, well, it's not cigarettes. And I'm like, yeah, it is.
Well, and I think that is right. So I think in general, the general public, the jury is out, and there are some people, even, you know, among healthcare professionals who are wondering whether maybe this is safer than cigarettes, and maybe they are for a very select older population who can't quit cigarettes, but that's not what we're talking about here. And the other thing that I think is really important to remember is that, speaking of nicotine addiction, 90% of smokers start smoking before the age of 18. And the tobacco companies know that, which is why they've traditionally marketed to kids. And so if you get kids addicted to nicotine using something else like an electronic cigarette, we now know that kids who use e-cigarettes are more likely to go on to smoke. They now have a new client base.
Yeah, there is a strong push for legislation, and there is a good amount of legislation out there to prohibit sales to minors, but they can still buy them in some of the retail stores and the vaping stores, where people aren't checking for ages, buying it on the internet. There are other places, and one of the interesting things that I found as I researched for this discussion was that there are vaping tricks, and you can go on YouTube and you can learn about different ways to breathe deeper and faster.
Just because we talked a little bit about regulation and advocacy, I think it's important for us to also recognize a couple of things that are unique to Nassau County. Mm-hmm. So Nassau County last year, and then New York State in the spring of this year, passed Tobacco 21 legislation, which prohibits anyone under the age of 21 from purchasing tobacco or tobacco-like products. However, it's important to know that we know from epidemiologic data that 50% of the time that children who are less than 21 try to buy these products, they are successful. So the enforcement on the books is not the same as the enforcement that is actually going on in the stores. There is a bill that has been introduced by actually a local legislator, Legislator Arnie Drucker,
right,
which would eliminate the sale of flavoring in Nassau County. This was a bill that was also discussed got a lot of discussion at the state level, but ultimately did not pass. So that legislation has been brought to the Nassau County level. San Francisco and a city right outside San Francisco have already done this. And they've also placed restrictions on ordering vape and vape-like products over the internet. So if you order a vape product over the internet, because the concern is that someone who's less than 21 could do so, they actually have to be signed for like any other critical package, and that person has to have an identification that notes that they are older than 21. And that's the hope that we can interrupt the on-ramp of lifelong tobacco addiction that really e-cigarettes have kind of become, particularly with the youthful appeal of the flavorings.
Southern California actually had reported on a study that they did where they were able to limit the advertising to teenagers, and they actually found a decrease in use.
So you used to be able to smell cigarette smoke on someone's breath and clothes. How can a parent know if their child is using one of these types of products, and what should they do if the child does use them?
So first of all, it is true it's very hard to smell. And you probably don't have that third-hand smell that we have with tobacco smoke, where you can tell that's third-hand smoke when somebody's been smoking and you don't see it. You may be able to smell some of the fruity flavors, and there probably is third-hand aerosol deposition. But I actually think, and just as a pediatrician, that probably the best approach is trying to talk to your kid honestly. Kids are very good at hiding things, and one of the concerns with these, particularly like Juul, and most people have seen the pictures of Juul. It looks like a jump drive, a very small thing that can be hidden and used without anybody knowing it. That kids really can probably keep these pretty well hidden from their parents. The best thing, I think, is to really try to engage in a meaningful conversation and understand that if your child is using it, that probably the best thing is not to ground them, but to recognize they're probably addicted and try to partner with them, and to start from there. We don't have really, I don't think, an evidence base of what to do at this point. But I don't think, I was having a conversation with somebody recently, and she asked me, well, wouldn't it be better if we could just get universal drug testing for all parents? I'm like, I don't think that would work, because kids will still do what kids do. But they're going to need to engage in the conversation.
I think that the limitation of the flavors will make a difference. Maybe, I can't tell you magnitude of difference, but most of the kids that start with electronic cigarettes who are not traditional cigarette smokers start with flavors, and they continue because they can experiment with more flavors. There are many, many varieties, and that's not only the issue that we talked about before, and we'll talk about again, in terms of the fact that nicotine stimulates or activates the receptors in your brain that regulate pleasure. And so that if you're using nicotine over time, you're going to need more nicotine to get the same kind of a response. So I think restricting the flavors hopefully will make a difference.
Now, I just want to echo Dr. Boykin's comment about not trying to actively police your children and actually engaging in a conversation with them. I think parents somehow think that because their parents might have recognized that they might have smoked at some point, that they'll be able to figure it out. I was discussing this with a teenager who was basically trying to say, well, you know, kids today were so much smarter than our parents, and the same way we all thought we were smarter than our parents. But then he just said this, and then he just turned his head and he just coughed a little. And he said, I could have just vaped right then and there. What a lot of kids are doing is they're inhaling through one sleeve and actually exhaling through the other sleeve in class, while the teacher might even be turned around and using the smartboard. And that's a way that none of us will be able to actively detect. And to give you an idea of just how pervasive this is, when electronic cigarette paraphernalia is found in different schools are actually all trying to figure out how to deal with this. But one school superintendent told me that he spends more time talking about electronic cigarettes now in his high schools, than he does talking to kids about college. That should give us some pause about understanding just how pervasive this is.
Just out of curiosity, you'd mentioned that they could look like jump drives. I've heard they could look like pens.
Yeah, the vape pen is actually the earlier edition, but yeah, they can look like anything.
Because I remember it was a while ago. I was working in the children's room, and obviously this is now the sign says no vaping and smoking within, I think, 100 feet of the building. I have to go and check with the most. I think it's 100 feet. Yeah, you're shaking 100 feet. But I remember like looking at my coworker and being like, "Is that kid like sucking on a pen? Like, what's going on?" I'd never seen that before, but it was more like a weird thing. Like, I looked twice because it looked so bizarre. I hadn't thought that it could be an electronic cigarette, but now they could look like anything.
Right.
So how addictive are electronic cigarettes compared to regular cigarettes and chewable tobacco, and what are the long-term consequences of using these types of products on children's health?
That's actually a very interesting question, because many people have used more than one tobacco product, but I think that most of the teenagers are starting with the electronic cigarettes. So when we talk about side effects, we can talk about problems with nicotine and certainly their effect on the brain and the reward system. But also remember that in addition to being as addictive as it is on the developing brain, that it can make other substances that are addictive, like cocaine and THC, also look more desirable or pleasurable. And there are effects on the brain in terms of addiction, but there are also effects on how the brain develops. So you might not be able to have good impulse control. You might have trouble with learning. You might have trouble with mood swings. There are a number of other side effects. And then certainly as a pulmonologist, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about its effect on asthma, the increased number of events that you can have, the exacerbations that you can have. And as well, because of all the contaminants in the solutions, your risk for cancers and other irritate responses.
Comparing the nicotine effect from a cigarette between a cigarette and an electronic cigarette. So we know that a cigarette has because they're fairly well regulated, delivers about 1 milligram of nicotine. So if you're a pack-a-day smoker, you get about 20 milligrams of nicotine. And that can be measured in the urine with a byproduct of nicotine called cotinine. And that's been well studied, and we kind of can measure that. With vaping, it's very hard to measure. The solutions can range from very low concentration to very high. Juul in particular, and the fourth generations tend to have very, very high concentration solutions. And so in general, when you look at it, Juul is called a pod system because it literally comes with a pod, those little colored things that go in there. And in one pod, that delivers about the equivalent of a pack of cigarettes. So, when we look at the literature on how kids tend to get addicted to cigarettes. They tend to not have the same patterns that adults do. When teenagers start smoking, they may smoke infrequently. They might smoke a couple times a week, 3 times a week, and then they ramp it up. And we know that by the time they're 21, they're going to be addicted smokers. Some of these kids, when you see what they're doing, they're vaping potentially a pod or 2 a day, which is way more than kids, when you look at the kids who initiate smoking do. So my feeling is that they're getting a lot more nicotine. It's hard to tell exactly if they're much, much more addicted, but certainly some of the preliminary studies, we actually just published one that was pretty, it's a small number, but it's pretty impressive in terms of the addictive symptoms. So I can go out on a limb and say I think these things are very addictive, and they're probably getting a lot more nicotine initially than kids who would start smoking.
I think it's important also to know that from the time that these, the first generation electronic cigarettes and even the cigalikes were introduced, they were marketed and sold as safer and healthier alternatives to cigarettes. And we now know that that may or may not be true. There is data to suggest that, just to piggyback onto the lung issue, that the flavoring solutions themselves and the heavy metals that are in those solutions, because of the batteries that are used to superheat this fluid into vapor, or quote unquote vapor, can independently adversely impact the developing lung. And because children's lungs are actively developing, there is the ability for them to get excessive swelling or inflammation in the lung, at least in some smaller studies and in some animal studies. I also think it's important to know that even the makers of Juul have recently stated publicly that they do not know what the long-term effects of their products will be. And that's just because they are so new. And I think that when you have something that is that new, that is being used at epidemic levels by children who are actively developing both their lungs and their nervous system, there really has to be a lot of caution, and that caution should be the first principle. I talk about this all the time, especially having preteens, and some of us have teenagers, is that when you have teenagers, everything is drama, right? Everything is drama. And that's because they experience things, because of the way they are neurologically wired, they experience intense highs and intense lows. So, to talk about what Dr. Boykin and Dr. Cataletto have been saying is that when a teenager first uses and gets exposed to an extremely high level of nicotine, they feel that intense pleasure at a level that they will probably never feel again in their lives. And they wind up using nicotine more frequently and potentially at higher doses, and then piggybacking the nicotine use with other substances like THC and like other drugs, all in search of that first intense pleasurable feeling that they had when they first tried it.
And again, this is just a detail about the pods, but I think it's important. How is it that it's so easy to inhale such a high nicotine concentration solution? The 4th generation products, the pods, are a nicotine salt. It's a different form of nicotine from the first 3 generations. And so if you go to the websites and you look at some of the advertisements from the vaping shops, they basically say, it's great. You would never be able to inhale this much nicotine in the prior form, basically. But, in the salt form now, it makes it easy. And that really, I think is, again, one of the reasons that the kids are so easily addicted, because it's kind of a toxic thing. If you were to try to make this kind of concentration in the other non-salt form, it's called a freebase form. It's very hard that was sort of the limiting factor, but that was the newest addition that made it really easy. And I suspect that's one of the reasons that for the incredible popularity of these products that just took off in 2017 to 2018.
So we touched upon how flavors are, really play a big role in getting kids addicted and making this appealing to children. But does vaping mean that kids will go on to smoke regular cigarettes or use some other substances, other illicit substances? Does it make it more, obviously like regular cigarettes don't come in 1,500 flavors. Is this a gateway to going there?
It looks that way. And the preliminary data supports that.
Interesting.
Yeah, actually, I would say there's been pretty good data at this point. It's been several really large studies. It looks like it's at least 5 times. Kids are at least 5 times more likely. Kids who try electronic cigarettes to go on to smoke than the kids who don't try them. And if you put that in the context of before these came on the market, we were at an all-time low for kids initiating smoking. That's a bad number. Because it's really reversing directions. We also know that kids who vape are much more likely to use marijuana, and probably other some preliminary data, other combusted tobacco, concurrent use of smoking, also using things like chewable tobacco. So, is it a gateway? I'm not sure we can say it's causality, but it sure looks like it. It probably will be.
I think it's important also, again, to talk about the role of flavoring again, which I know we've talked about many times, but it's not just that that the flavoring entices kids to potentially start using electronic cigarettes or electronic nicotine delivery systems. But about 60% of the time, if you specifically ask children why they continue to do this, 60% of the time, they specifically cite the flavorings as the reason that they continue to use these products. And I think we've seen that, right? We have tobacco companies saying, well, we want there to be a vast spectrum of flavors to appeal to any adult who wants them. But then you have flavors like Fruit Loop and flavors like Cinnamon Toast Crunch, flavors that I think most of us in this room are not actively seeking out, but are clearly, at least appear to be, directly marketed or directly appealing to children.
Those comments are interesting because some of the brands have gone after the flavoring companies and said you can't use Tootsie Rolls or Skittles or whatever the brand name is.
Right.
And so that has changed. But in terms of what Dr. Shah said about the flavorings, one of the reasons is not just the flavorings, but the fact that you have a variety to choose from. You can mix your own and you can make it customized to whatever your mood is.
So we touched upon this as well, but we mentioned so the age to buy tobacco now is 21 years old. So how are kids getting their hands on these products?
We have legislation in a lot of places, but clearly we don't have Tobacco 21 everywhere, and it doesn't always fit with electronic cigarettes. I wish it were, and I wish we had better enforcement. But I think that we have to work on local policy, school policies, discussions with parents at home and kids at home. We have a lot of work to do.
I really do think parents really need to understand what this is. I mean, you know, even with the best intentions, I don't think they do. I really, really don't.
If you asked parents, they would have probably the same answers as the kids about nicotine. Is there nicotine in an electronic cigarette? Do they know the answer? Do they know what dripping is? Do they know the different types of ways that you can identify the different types of e-cigarettes and devices? So I think education is one of the very first things that we have to do to get this message out there.
Education from the top down.
That's
I mean,
right.
The parents really need to be empowered to understand what this is, to have these conversations with their kids.
That's right. You can't have the conversation without the knowledge.
Exactly. Yes.
And I think just as a broader public health message, again, that goes back to some of the legislation. But yes, Tobacco 21 is going to be incredibly important. Removing flavorings is going to be incredibly important. But I also think significantly restricting the advertising and changing the messaging, because, a lot of the parents, when you talk to them, they're confused. It's not that everybody's heard of them, but they're confused. And most of that is not because they don't want to believe that they're bad, but because it's all over. It permeates their world that these are safer, and it's probably a better alternative. And what people don't stop to think about, I think sometimes, is if you hear that, okay, this is a better alternative to smoking, it doesn't mean your kid should do it. So But that's the problem, because they have a favorable attitude towards these things, and yet they're not recognizing that it's okay for it to be favorable in a 70-year-old, but has nothing to do with a kid using it. Should not be using it.
Could I just? Oh,
yeah.
Just a point about the advertising, right? So the town of Hempstead recently passed legislation that would forbid the advertising of any tobacco, including electronic cigarette products, within 1,000 feet of any school, park, playground, community center, pool, community pool, any place where children are more likely to spend a lot of their time. And one of the things that I'm very proud about is that the American Academy of Pediatrics here on Long Island has been able to take that legislation and hopefully get that introduced in a bipartisan manner, also led by legislator Drucker, who's a real friend to children and
Yes.
a local legislator in Syosset, and hopefully get that enacted in Nassau County. So to all the parents who are hearing this podcast, it's worth a call to their local legislator saying that they're in support of this advertising restriction, because we know that children who do not see this type of advertising are 40% less likely to even consider or be tempted to initiate their first use of an electronic cigarette. To talk about Tobacco 21, we all agree that as a public health policy, raising the age to purchase tobacco products to 21 years is very important in terms of interrupting what used to be like the traditional pipeline, right? Which is that a 14 or 15-year-old would normally get a cigarette from a 16 or 18-year-old, or an 18-year-old who would buy it legally. Because when you're 14 and 15 and a freshman, the people who are cool are the seniors. So if the senior is smoking, you're more likely to continue to try smoking. But the fact of the matter is, all of those laws are only as good as their enforcement. And it's very important to look at the details of the legislation. We're very lucky in New York State to have Tobacco 21 legislation that penalizes the owners of the stores for a violation. That's really important, because there are some states that have tried to introduce Tobacco 21 legislation, sometimes in concert with tobacco companies, that don't penalize the person who owns the store, the real entrepreneur who's making the profit, but penalize the person who's actually doing the sale. So the clerk who's in the store. Now that clerk is probably someone who's earning, minimum wage or slightly higher, who has a high school or college, is working their way through high school and college. So penalizing them with a $1,000 or $5,000 fine really doesn't motivate the institution or the store to change their behavior.
Once again, top down in that case. Yeah. If you don't mind, I just wanted to ask something that, it's something, again, I can't even remember, but I do know a few times we've mentioned that this is being introduced as a safer alternative to smoking. Where did that come from? Because I remember hearing that too, but where did that whole terminology come from?
So electronic cigarettes are not combusted. They're not there. So there isn't tar. In terms of the combustion of a cigarette, and that is associated with the cancer and so forth, and so that is what people, associate with the badness of cigarettes, and so in that sense, maybe there is a safer profile. The problem is what we don't know about all the other things that we've been mentioning today, the other components of it. There certainly are other carcinogens,
right.
But they were adopted very, I think, energetically, because most people want to quit smoking. 70% of smokers want to quit smoking. And if you have this thing that is marketed to you as a safer alternative, and then everybody gets a favorable profile, there you go. It's branded quickly.
See, that's what I had thought. And initially it was supposed to be something for people who wanted to quit.
That's what they say.
But it's really funneling
It's never been presented as a medication.
No, absolutely not.
I think. I mean, I can be a conspiracy theorist. Thank you here, and say that I think that the tobacco companies recognized that they were losing market share and have wanted to regain that, and have been looking at alternatives to keep people hooked to nicotine, and again, knowing that people under age 18 who start using this stuff will use it for life. And so if you look at the marketing of these products, it's predominantly looks like it's being marketed to kids.
It
even
absolutely
though they say
does.
it's great for cessation.
I think it's important. There's one study that was really well done that was published in one of the most prominent journals in medicine, the New England Journal of Medicine, that did show that electronic cigarettes in adult smokers who were motivated to quit did reduce the amount of cigarettes they smoked and did improve their ability to quit over approximately a year. But it's also important to understand that study, when you look at any study, it's always not just what it showed, but how applicable it is to our community. Because there's a whole range of environments that people live in. The New England Journal of Medicine article that is often pointed to by the tobacco industry and was a well-done study took place in Britain with the national healthcare system and allowed for all of the patients to get weekly visits with their doctors. I don't know how many people who are trying to quit tobacco in the United States right now are going to their doctor weekly to help make sure that they're being weaned off nicotine appropriately, and that if they have any withdrawal symptoms, that those withdrawal symptoms are being taken care of. And this is always one of my sort of pet peeves, because people talk about this as, well, the nicotine can help wean you off the traditional cigarettes. But if that's true, then it should be regulated as a pharmaceutical.
Exactly. This is what we were just talking about. It's not being marketed as a medication at all. It's like being marketed like candy.
Right. But if you're going to make it a medication, then the amount of nicotine needs to be regulated.
Yeah.
So we can see how much nicotine you're using, start you on roughly the similar amount, and wean you off it over time, the way we wean you off any potential addictive substance. But the amount of nicotine that people take in through these products is so variable, right? And is in some ways maybe even purposefully altered to fluctuate, to create that constant craving and that constant need.
And there have been several studies that have looked at adult smokers looking to use electronic cigarettes to quit. And what they found is, and this has been done looking at measuring their metabolites in the urine and so forth, that they will vape until they maintain the level of nicotine that they're used to, which means it's really not helping them quit. A very quick word on how smoking cessation medications actually work, because people often ask about that. If I prescribe a nicotine replacement patch and gum, for example, which is over the counter to a parent who is a smoker, and I do that, they say, well, this is nicotine. I'm trading one nicotine for the other. The truth is that you get a rush from the nicotine in a cigarette, and you get a rush from the nicotine in a vaping device most of the time, because of the way the nicotine is. In the patch and the gum, it's like a long-acting. So if you were to take a long-acting medication, it takes longer to get into your system, essentially. And people I think, are familiar with that concept. So the cessation medications have nicotine in a longer-acting form, so that you can wean yourself off of that. You're not really as addicted. It helps you stop, but you don't have that same sort of rush. And until this is regulated, I just don't think it's really going to work. And it certainly is the wrong message.
So, go ahead.
No, I was just going to mention that we have FDA regulated nicotine in patches. We know it works in cessation. We know we have nicotine gums. We know it works. We don't know that the electronic cigarettes work, but we know that we can deliver variable amounts of nicotine until people feel that they've reached the level that they want. But even when you look at the studies that have gone out and looked at multiple preparations, and the concentrations aren't always accurate.
So I just two more questions before we go. So even though the use of these products, we talked about, they can be concealed. Schools frequently encounter children using e-cigarettes. There doesn't seem to be a uniform approach across the districts. As a pediatrician, how would you recommend schools handle the issue of teenage vape use?
Go. I'll weigh in after.
Okay. It's going to be a tough thing for the schools to do, because it's often very hard to identify kids that are using it, or to find vaping devices and things like that. But I think that the point that Dr. Boykin made before about having conversations and talking to students before they are addicted or in the early phases is probably something that should be done early on.
And I think this is actually something we're starting to study because we have to figure it out. And there's as Dr. Cataletta said, there's many different ways schools are dealing with this, from removing bathroom doors to not letting kids go to the bathroom. The bathrooms are often the places where they vape. Kids will tell you that's the vape room now. Installing vaping devices, sensor devices, immediate expulsion. Fines. Some schools have imposed, fines of $500. All of these things, I have to say, I think there have to be rules, and the message has to be tobacco free. But I also think that expelling somebody with no further action is not going to be effective. And I think the missing piece is recognizing that some of these kids may be too addicted to make it through school without doing it. And if we don't address that, which we don't really know how to address either. If the next question is, how do you address addiction with these? We don't know. We don't know how exactly what medications we could use. We really need to learn this because we're now backpedaling. But I do think the first step is having an open conversation and understanding that these kids need help. If you were to have a kid who's opiate addicted, in a school, the first thing you do is you involve the healthcare community to help them overcome this addiction. And I don't think we are at the point where we recognize the potential level of addiction of these devices.
This is like this conversation is kind of coming full circle because Dr. Shah was talking about just the importance of a frank conversation and understanding that these are addictions. Did you want to add anything to that?
It's interesting because we talk about the addiction without really addressing the withdrawal when we talk about schools and what they're going to do. And if you have somebody who's going through nicotine withdrawal, they're irritable and they can't focus and they may have trouble with impulse control. I mean, there are a lot of things that are involved here, and I think that the schools should work with their school physicians and try and, come up with solutions that are individualized for independent students.
So as a community, what can we do to help reduce the epidemic of teen vaping? We've touched upon just different points. We've touched upon areas that have tried strategies. Are there any specific, particularly successful strategies that other states, counties, or towns have used that we haven't touched upon already that have decreased the amount of teenage vaping?
I don't think anybody's really done it. Gotten anywhere with this at this point. I don't know of a single. I think there've been some heroic efforts. I think San Francisco
that was the one where they have to.
Flavors.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Ban on flavors. I have no idea how this hasn't obviously taken place yet. We'll see. I think we really don't know. I think the truth has to get out about them. People need to start. We need a little more buy-in and a little more understanding about that they're not inhaling like water vapors. This is tobacco. If we can start there,
nicotine,
we can move forward on all the other stuff. I think.
I also think that there's a role here for a degree of corporate responsibility from a lot of social media groups. The impact of social media is obviously evident in all of us, but is particularly influential to younger children. And a lot of the original electronic cigarette marketing began and continues to be done virtually. And at some point, one would hope that the social media platforms or the social media giants who know where their advertising is being directed and who actually are appealing to companies specifically because they can surgically target different demographics with their marketing would take reasonable approaches to making sure that these ads aren't being seen by children or aren't being portrayed in a way that's appealing to children.
The problem with that is that, of course, the tobacco companies are not going to voluntarily do that because they still want to sell their product. Even if they, as Jewel recently did, say they're sorry. Again, this is the conspiracy theorist. I don't trust them to actually do the right thing unless it's legislated. I think Dr. Shaw makes an important point. There were actually several studies in the last couple of years looking at the impact of messaging on Twitter and Juul, and the fact that, this is something I've recently learned to do. You can retweet something. So when somebody tweets something, you can pass it out again.
Yeah,
that's
retweet,
right?
Retweets are they're big in the Twitter world. The amount of times you're retweeted is
right. So there were several studies that looked at who was retweeting the Juul company's tweets, and from varying in different studies, it was anywhere from 25% to almost 60% of them were under 18 years of age. So, and now how is that going to be legislated? That's a problem to me.
Well, there has to be, I think, some corporate responsibility. I think we saw that with the measles epidemic, where we did see social media groups begin to understand the role that they were playing and to take somewhat limited steps, but to take small measures to make sure that misinformation was not traveling faster than legitimate information. And I think they could do something similar if they wanted to. Of course, there's the need, there's the desire, and of course there's the will. And unfortunately, for a lot of those corporations, they only came upon doing this once there was the threat of government intervention and there was a large popular outcry. So we need both of those things, I think, if we're going to sort of move the needle on those companies.
Well, I want to thank you all so much. Dr. Cataletto, Dr. Boykin, and Dr. Shaw, thank you so much for coming and talking about this serious topic. I learned a bunch of things that I didn't know but was curious about. And I think we all have a responsibility to educate one another and parents and children. I'm going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.